Today we're taking a deep dive into America's involvement in World War I, and we're using this really interesting history textbook chapter as our guide. I gotta say, it's fascinating how much we think we know about history, you know? But then you dig a little deeper and suddenly you're finding all these new perspectives and hidden connections. Like, did you know that America's whole experience building the Panama Canal actually set the stage for their foreign policy leading up to World War I?
Yeah, it's pretty wild when you think about
Or
it.
that Woodrow Wilson, who we think of as this idealist, actually oversaw a period of increased segregation here at home. And get this, there's this surprising link between wartime propaganda and the fight for women's suffrage. Seriously, we've got a lot to cover today. So
Buckle up.
to help us unpack all of this, we've got an expert with us. Welcome.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to dive into this. It's a fascinating period of history.
So let's start with Panama. How did building the canal shape America's foreign policy?
Well, the success of the project really fueled this sense of national power.
Hmm.
And it also kind of solidified this belief in America's ability to, shape global events.
Right. It's like the country had this growth spurt and they were ready to flex their muscles on the world stage.
Exactly. But it wasn't just about showing off their strength.
No, it was more strategic than that.
It was definitely about protecting American interests, especially in the Western Hemisphere. The Roosevelt Corollary, which was an addition to the Monroe Doctrine,
Right.
essentially declared America's right to act as a police force in the region.
So they were playing the role of protector.
Right.
But it sounds like it was often about protecting American business interests.
Yeah, I mean, you could definitely say that there was an element of self-interest at play, for sure.
Right, like a convenient excuse for intervention.
And this is where it gets really interesting when we start to look at Woodrow Wilson.
Oh yeah, he's such a complex figure.
Totally. He came into office with this idea of moral imperialism.
Moral imperialism.
Hmm.
That almost sounds like a contradiction. What did that actually look like in practice?
Okay, so basically Wilson believed that America had this moral duty to promote democracy and peace around the world, even if it meant using military force.
Wow.
But at the same time, back home, he was overseeing increased segregation and discrimination against African Americans.
It's like he was promoting these grand ideals abroad, but failing to uphold them in his own country.
Mm.
A very complex legacy for sure.
Absolutely.
And this complexity is also evident in America's initial reaction to the war in Europe.
Yeah, a lot of Americans were advocating for isolationism. There were so many different factors at play.
It's interesting, the source material mentions some surprising members of that stay out of it camp. Feminists, pacifists, and social reformers. It's really fascinating how their opposition to war came from such different motivations.
Yeah, it's true. The anti-war movement was definitely not a homogenous group. For example, many feminists saw war as this ultimate expression of patriarchal violence.
Oh, I see, like a distraction from the fight for social justice.
Exactly.
So while Europe was descending into chaos, America was wrestling with its own debates about identity, morality, and what it even meant to be a nation.
Absolutely.
Talk about a crossroads.
Then you have the sinking of the Lusitania in 1915. This was a civilian ocean liner that was torpedoed by a German U-boat.
Right, a huge tragedy.
Over 1,000 people died, including 128 Americans.
Wow.
This event really shifted public opinion in America.
It's hard to imagine the shock and outrage that must have rippled through the country.
Definitely. The loss of American lives, combined with Germany's increasingly aggressive submarine warfare, really started to erode support for isolationism.
It's amazing how a single event can have such a dramatic impact on public sentiment.
Absolutely. And here's where things get really interesting.
Yeah.
Are you ready for this?
Hit me.
The Zimmermann telegram.
Oh, yeah. Now, that's one for the history books.
All right.
Really is.
Oh, yeah.
So picture this. 1917, Germany is desperate.
Okay.
And their Foreign Secretary Zimmermann sends this secret message to Mexico,
Uh-huh.
right? Their proposal. Mexico joins the war on Germany's side, attacks the U.S., and in return, they get back Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, all that territory they lost way back.
Wow. So did Mexico bite?
Well, it was a risky gamble, and it totally backfired.
Yeah.
British intelligence intercepted the telegram. They decoded it and leaked it to the American press.
I bet that caused an uproar.
Oh, you better believe it.
Mm.
Americans were furious and terrified.
Right.
This wasn't some, far-off European conflict anymore.
Right.
It was a direct threat to their homeland.
Right.
And you combine that with Germany, sinking American ships, and, well, that was the final straw.
Uh-huh.
Public opinion just swung hard towards war.
And on April 6, 1917, the U.S. officially declared war on Germany.
Yeah.
So much for staying out of it.
Right. From he kept us out of war to over there in less than a year.
Yeah.
It really shows you how fast things can change on the world stage
Mm.
and how events that seem so far away can suddenly hit close to home.
And then just a few months later, on June 26, 1917,
Mm.
the first American troops arrived in France,
Yeah.
the Doughboys.
Uh-huh.
So it wasn't just talk. America was in it for real now.
Boots on the ground less than a year after that re-election promise.
Wow.
Talk about a dramatic shift in American foreign policy.
Right.
This was a turning point. America was stepping onto the world stage in a big way, and there was no going back. So we have America edging closer and closer to war.
Yeah, and as that happens, they start to mobilize on an unprecedented scale. This had a profound impact on American society.
The textbook actually calls this the social possibilities of war. It seems almost paradoxical. How could something as destructive as war create social possibilities?
It's really about the transformative power of wartime mobilization. Think about it. Before the war, the U.S. Army was pretty small, only about 120,000 men.
Right.
But during the war, it exploded to 5 million.
5 million. That's massive.
Yeah, that kind of growth required huge changes in every aspect of American life.
The government basically had to re-engineer the whole economy to support the war effort, like the War Industries Board, which took control of almost every aspect of industrial production.
Exactly. And then to manage this huge workforce, they created the War Labor Board.
Makes sense.
And this is where it gets interesting. The War Labor Board actually implemented a number of progressive policies.
Wait, progressive policies. I thought wartime was usually associated with the rollback of civil liberties and workers' rights.
That's usually the case, yeah. But World War I was different in a lot of ways. The need for a unified and productive workforce forced the government to make some concessions. So the War Labor Board implemented things like a minimum wage and 8-hour workday,
Wow.
and even protections for unions.
Talk about unintended consequences. So the war effort actually pushed forward a progressive agenda that might not have been possible during peacetime.
Exactly. And to fund this massive mobilization, the government implemented wartime taxes,
Right.
some of which reached as high as 60% for the wealthiest Americans.
60%. That's unheard of today. It really shows how different things were back then.
It does. The war effort demanded shared sacrifice, and the government wasn't afraid to ask the wealthy to contribute their fair share.
So we've got a nation completely mobilized for war, a society undergoing these dramatic transformations, and an economy operating under completely new rules. But public opinion, while shifting, was still pretty divided. So how did the government address that?
That's where the Committee on Public Information, or CPI, comes in.
A CPI.
They were tasked with shaping public opinion and building support for the war effort. They ran this very sophisticated propaganda campaign.
Ah, the propaganda machine. The book mentions these 4 Minutemen. It's just such a quirky detail. Can you imagine? 75,000 speakers deployed across the country to deliver pro-war speeches. That's like the pre-internet version of a viral marketing campaign.
Right. It was incredible. They were trained to deliver very specific messages. They would pop up at movie theaters, town squares, even churches, basically ensuring that the government's message reached every corner of American society.
The war really impacted everyday life, and one of the most significant changes was how it affected civil liberties.
Okay.
I mean, think about it. How do you balance freedom of speech with the need for national security during wartime? That's a really tough question.
Right.
And it became super relevant back then.
Yeah, and, our sources talk about the Espionage Act of 1917 and the Sedition Act of 1918.
Right.
These sound pretty serious.
They were. The government was really set on preventing any interference with the war effort. So the Espionage Act made it a crime to obstruct military recruitment or help the enemy.
Okay.
Then the Sedition Act came along, and that went even further. It made it illegal to speak or publish anything considered disloyal to the government or the war effort.
So basically, criticizing the war could get you in trouble.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
It's a far cry from how we think about free speech today.
Yeah, it really is. And it led to some shocking cases.
Yeah.
Like our sources mention Charles Schenck, for example. He was a socialist who was really against the war and the draft.
Right. He believed it was a war fought to benefit the capitalists.
Oh, wow.
And that the draft was basically forced servitude.
So he was pretty outspoken.
Oh, yeah. He was printing and distributing leaflets, urging young men to resist the draft. He even cited the 13th Amendment, the one that outlawed slavery as justification.
So basically saying, don't go to war.
Exactly.
What happened to him?
Well, he was arrested and charged with violating the Espionage Act.
Of course.
The government saw his leaflets as a direct threat to the war effort. They claimed they could obstruct recruitment and undermine the military.
Wow. So even handing out leaflets could get you in big trouble.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Schenck argued that his actions were protected by the First Amendment.
Right.
Freedom of speech. And it went all the way to the Supreme Court
Wow.
in a landmark case, Schenck
Yeah.
v. United States.
That's the case with the famous shouting fire in a crowded theater analogy, right?
That's the one. In a unanimous decision, the Supreme Court upheld Schenck's conviction.
Wow.
They argued that his speech posed a clear and present danger to national security, just like shouting fire in a crowded theater would create a dangerous panic.
So even though he was speaking out against the war,
Right.
the court said his words could directly harm the war effort.
Exactly. That
Hmm.
was their reasoning. And it established this clear and present danger test to decide when the government could restrict speech.
Right.
It's a pretty controversial concept. And even today, we're still debating where to draw the line between free speech and national security.
Right. It makes you think, for sure.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's unsettling to think about how quickly things can change and how our freedoms would be limited when fear takes over.
It is, especially when you think about how it wasn't just legal restrictions.
Mm-hmm.
There was this whole wave of what some call coercive patriotism. Imagine a society where you're constantly pressured to show your loyalty and support for the war or face consequences.
So like my country, right or wrong, taken to the extreme.
Exactly. People were imprisoned for things like disrespecting the flag.
Oh, wow.
Schools had to be super patriotic. Teachers had to sign loyalty oaths. It was intense pressure to conform to show you were 100% American.
And our sources even talk about this group, the American Protective League, with everyday citizens spying on their neighbors.
Yeah, it was creepy. They had thousands of volunteers reporting anyone suspected of being un-American.
Mm-hmm.
Basically anyone who questioned the war or, sympathized with Germany.
Wow. So you have the government suppressing dissent,
Mm-hmm.
and then everyday Americans policing each other's thoughts and actions.
Yeah, it paints a pretty chilling picture of America during the war.
It does. It really does. It was a time of fear and paranoia
Yeah.
where even saying the wrong thing could have serious consequences.
Absolutely. It really shows how easily wartime anxieties can erode civil liberties and create suspicion and intolerance.
Okay, so let's take a little break from all this intensity for a sec.
Okay.
While all this was going on, President Wilson was busy working on his famous 14 points, his plan for peace. Tell us more about that.
Well, Wilson was an idealist. He really believed that this war could be the war to end all wars,
Okay.
if they could just, create a lasting peace. So his 14 points outlined this vision he had for a new world order, a world based on open diplomacy, freedom of the seas, free trade, arms reduction, self-determination for nations, and probably most importantly, the creation of a League of Nations.
So a global organization to prevent future conflicts.
Yeah, kind of like a proto-United Nations.
Sounds pretty progressive for the time.
It was. Wilson was ahead of his time in a lot of ways. He wanted to move past those old power games that had caused so much bloodshed. He believed that by working together, nations could resolve their differences peacefully and avoid future wars.
So the war ended on November 11th, 1918 with the signing of the armistice. Did Wilson's vision come true with the Treaty of Versailles?
Well, that's where things get a bit complicated. The Treaty of Versailles officially ended the war, but it was pretty far from Wilson's idealistic vision. In fact, a lot of historians argue that it actually set the stage for future conflicts.
Really?
Yeah, like World War II.
Oh, wow. How so?
Well, the treaty was really harsh on Germany. Heavy reparations, stripping them of their colonies, severely limiting their military.
Wow.
It also had this infamous war guilt clause,
Yeah.
basically blaming Germany for the whole war.
It's kind of ironic, isn't it? The U.S. president comes up with this grand peace plan, but then the U.S. doesn't even join the League of Nations.
Yeah, what happened there? Well, it was a big blow to Wilson and his vision.
Okay.
The U.S. Senate, driven by those isolationist sentiments, they refused to ratify the treaty. They were worried that joining the League would drag the U.S. into more European conflicts.
So the U.S., the country that proposed this global peace organization, stayed on the sidelines.
Yeah, it was a missed opportunity. It had some lasting consequences. The League, without the power and influence of the U.S., was significantly weakened. And those harsh terms on Germany, well, they fueled resentment and ultimately contributed to the rise of extremism and the outbreak of World War II.
It's a reminder that even with the best intentions, things can go wrong, and peace is something that needs constant work and commitment.
Definitely.
Yeah.
It also shows how important it is to understand different perspectives and find common ground.
Right.
In this case, the gap between Wilson's idealism and the Senate's isolationism was just too big, and it had tragic consequences.
Yeah. Okay, let's dig into another fascinating part of this era.
Okay.
World War I wasn't just about, battles and treaties.
Right.
It also had a huge impact on ideas about race and identity here in America.
It's true. The war and its aftermath forced Americans to confront some uncomfortable truths about their own society. It brought these long, simmering tensions about race, ethnicity, and what it meant to be American right to the surface.
Yeah, sources talk about how the race problem became a major issue during this time.
It did. This was a time when ideas about race were changing a lot. The concept of a scientific hierarchy of races was becoming more popular.
A hierarchy of races.
Yeah, the idea that some races were considered superior to others. It's a disturbing concept, but it was pretty widely accepted by scientists and intellectuals back then.
It's hard to believe they actually thought ethnicity was the same as race.
I know, right? But people genuinely believed that different ethnic groups like Italians or Jews were separate biological races, each with their own inherent traits and capabilities.
And of course, this hierarchy put Anglo-Saxons at the top.
Of course, right at the top, with other groups ranked below them.
So they were using this pseudoscience to justify discrimination and prejudice.
Exactly. It was used to argue that some groups were just inherently more intelligent, moral, or fit for citizenship than others. It fueled the rise of eugenics.
Eugenics.
Yeah, the idea that you could improve the human race through selective breeding and eliminating undesirable traits. It's a dark chapter in the history of science, and it had a lasting impact on social policy and attitudes about race.
Our sources mention this specific example of a racial hierarchy with Anglo-Saxons on top and groups like Hebrews, Italians, and Southern Europeans further down.
It's a shocking idea to us now.
It really is.
But this kind of thinking was common back then. It was used to justify all sorts of discriminatory practices, from immigration restrictions to segregation.
Wow.
And it created a lot of anxiety among some white Americans who were afraid of losing their dominance because of all the immigrants coming in and the country's changing demographics.
That fear of losing their place in society
Right.
seems to be a recurring theme throughout history.
It does, and it often leads to attempts to control and exclude anyone who is seen as different or threatening. In this case, it led to this push for Americanization.
What was that?
It was a movement aimed at assimilating immigrants into a single homogeneous American culture,
Okay.
often at the expense of their own cultural traditions and languages.
So it's more about conformity than actual inclusion.
Yeah, in a lot of ways. The idea was that everyone should just melt into this one American identity,
Right.
shedding their old ways and embracing the values and norms of the dominant Anglo-Saxon culture. It's a well-intentioned idea on some level, but it often ended up suppressing cultural diversity and reinforcing the existing power structure.
And this push for Americanization became even stronger during the war.
Absolutely. The war created this atmosphere of heightened nationalism and xenophobia.
Right.
Suddenly, anyone who didn't fit into this very narrow definition of American was viewed with suspicion.
Right.
It led to a wave of anti-immigrant sentiment and a crackdown on anyone seen as disloyal or subversive.
And the most obvious example of this was the anti-German crusade.
Right.
It's kind of amazing how quickly wartime propaganda can demonize an entire group of people.
It's true. Overnight, German Americans, many of whom had been living in the U.S. for generations, became the enemy. Their language was banned, their music boycotted.
Really?
Yeah, they faced harassment and discrimination. Some even changed their names just to avoid persecution.
It's a stark reminder of how easily fear and prejudice can take root, even in a nation that prides itself on diversity and tolerance.
It is. It also reminds us of how important it is to think critically and question the narratives that are presented to us, especially during times of crisis.
Right. And this suspicion of anything foreign didn't stop with German Americans.
No.
Our sources point to Jews and Italians as other targets of this anti-immigrant sentiment. They were labeled un-American and seen as threats to American values and traditions.
Right. It's a pattern we see over and over again in history.
Right.
When times get tough, people look for someone to blame. And it's often those who are perceived as different or outsiders who get targeted.
Right.
In this case, Jews and Italians, many of whom were recent immigrants, became easy targets for those anxieties about the changing face of America.
And this fear wasn't just directed at immigrants.
No.
There was also a growing anxiety about socialism and anarchism, especially after the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia.
Right. The rise of communism in Russia really shook the Western world.
Yeah.
It fueled fears of a global communist revolution.
Right.
And here in the U.S., it led to the first Red Scare.
The Red Scare.
Yeah, a period of intense political repression and paranoia.
So anyone who had leftist ideas
Right.
or criticized the government
Uh-huh.
was suddenly labeled a communist and a threat to national security.
Pretty much. The Red Scare was a time when freedom of speech and association were severely restricted.
Whoa.
People were arrested for their political beliefs, deported for their activism, and blacklisted for supposed ties to communist organizations.
It's like the pendulum can swing so quickly from one extreme to the other.
That can, especially when fear and uncertainty are running high.
And the line between protecting national security and suppressing dissent can be very thin.
Very thin.
It wasn't just European immigrants and political radicals who were facing discrimination during this time.
Right.
Our sources also mention the experiences of other marginalized groups like Mexicans,
Mm-hmm.
Puerto Ricans, and Asian Americans.
Yeah, they all faced unique challenges because of their race,
Right.
ethnicity, and their place in American society.
Right.
They're often caught between two worlds, not fully accepted as Americans,
Right.
but also denied the rights and opportunities of their homelands.
Right. And our sources specifically mention the situation of Puerto Ricans who were granted U.S. citizenship in 1917,
Right.
but still lacked full voting rights and representation in Congress.
It's a good example of how citizenship doesn't always equal equality.
Yeah.
Puerto Ricans were expected to fight and die for the U.S. in World War I,
Right.
but they didn't have basic rights and freedoms at home.
So it seems World War I wasn't just about America's role on the world stage.
Yeah.
It also exposed and made worse these deep divisions within American society
It did.
and raised questions about race, identity, and belonging that we're still grappling with today.
Absolutely.
Okay, let's turn our attention to another big development that was happening during this era.
Okay.
The Great Migration. Hundreds of thousands of Black Americans were leaving the South and heading to northern cities,
Right.
seeking better opportunities and escape from the Jim Crow South.
The Great Migration was a huge event in American history. It completely reshaped the demographics of the country
Wow.
and led to these vibrant Black communities in northern cities.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just a simple story of escaping to a better life.
Right. Our sources suggest this promised land wasn't always so promising.
Exactly. Well, the North offered more opportunities than the segregated South.
Mm-hmm.
Black migrants still faced discrimination, limited job prospects, housing segregation, and sometimes even violence.
So they were escaping one kind of oppression,
Yeah.
only to face another.
It was a tough reality for a lot of people who had hoped for a fairer society in the North. They were met with prejudice competition for jobs and housing and even violence.
One person who became really important during this time was Marcus Garvey.
Oh, yeah?
He was a powerful advocate for Black nationalism and self-reliance.
He was a charismatic and controversial figure, but he captured the imagination of many Black Americans who were tired of the racism and inequality they faced.
Right.
He talked about Black pride, self-determination, and even a return to Africa.
His ideas resonated with so many who felt marginalized.
They did. Garveyism, as his movement was called, was a really complex ideology. It emphasized Black economic empowerment, cultural pride, and a vision of a united Africa free from colonial rule.
Wow.
It's a powerful message that challenged the status quo and inspired a lot of Black activists.
But his movement faced a lot of opposition, didn't it?
It did. His ideas were seen as radical and threatening by a lot of people, both within the Black community and among white Americans. He was accused of being divisive and even dangerous.
Yeah.
Ultimately, he was convicted on trumped-up charges and deported back to Jamaica.
Wow.
But his legacy lived on and inspired future generations of Black nationalists and Pan-Africanists.
It's a good reminder that even when facing huge challenges,
Yeah.
people find ways to resist, to dream, and to fight for a better future.
Absolutely. And sometimes the most powerful voices for change come from those who have been marginalized and silenced.
The years after the war saw a surge in racial tension and violence.
Unfortunately, yeah.
Lynchings in the South, Black veterans were targeted.
It's true.
And then there was the horrific Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921.
Yeah, the Tulsa Race Massacre was a truly terrible moment in American history. A thriving Black community in Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street because of its economic success,
Wow.
was just destroyed by a white mob. Homes and businesses were looted and burned, and countless black residents were killed or driven from their homes.
It's a devastating example of the racial hatred and violence that was happening in America back then.
It is. It's also a reminder that it's important to remember and learn from these dark parts of our history.
Oh.
Only by confronting the uncomfortable truths about our past can we hope to build a more just and equitable future.
World War I had ripple effects far beyond America. It was a global conflict that led to the collapse of empires, the redrawing of borders, and the rise of new ideologies.
Definitely.
Ah,
One of the biggest events was the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917,
right,
which led to the creation of the Soviet Union,
right.
the world's first communist state.
This was a turning point in world history.
It was.
It inspired revolutionary movements all over the globe.
Yeah,
And it also sparked fear in the West of a global communist takeover.
absolutely. The rise of communism was a major source of anxiety for the U.S. and other Western powers.
Right.
It fueled the Red Scare we talked about earlier, and it led to this global ideological struggle between communism and capitalism that shaped the entire 20th century.
And as if war, social unrest, and political upheaval weren't enough,
Yeah.
the world was also dealing with the Spanish flu pandemic.
Oh, yeah. The Spanish flu pandemic from 1918 to 1919 was a global catastrophe that killed millions.
Wow.
It strained healthcare systems, disrupted economies, and created widespread fear and uncertainty.
It's hard to imagine dealing with a world war, racial tensions, labor unrest, and a deadly pandemic all at the same time.
I know, it must have felt like the world was falling apart.
It must have. It was a time of intense upheaval and turmoil,
It was.
both domestically and internationally.
And it left a lasting sense of trauma loss and a deep unease about the future. The old certainties were gone, and the world was entering a new and uncertain era.
Wow, that was a lot to unpack.
It was.
From neutrality to global conflict,
Mhm.
from battles abroad to battles over freedom and identity here at home, World War I really changed America in profound ways.
It did, and we've only scratched the surface.
Right. There's still so much more to learn about this era and its lasting impact. And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into America's involvement in World War I. Thank you for coming along with us on this journey.
Thanks for listening.
We hope you'll keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep learning. Because remember, the past isn't really gone.
Yeah.
It lives on in us, and it's up to us to make sure its lessons are never forgotten.